morning, everyone. My name is Daniel Gomez Mazo, and it is a true joy and honor to be here today. I am a proud alumnus of UCLA School of Law, where I completed my LLM back in 2014. And this institution profoundly shaped the way I think about justice, power, and the transformative potential of the law. So being here today, this morning, feels in many ways like coming home. I have the privilege of joining this conversation as one of the founding members of ILEX Acción Jurídica, a civil society organization dedicated to promoting racial justice and combating racism and racial discrimination in Colombia and in Latin America. ILEX was co-founded by a group of Black women and LGBTQ lawyers, and is the first organization of its kind in Colombia. It engages in strategic litigation, social legal research, communications, and community-based advocacy, with the purpose of making use of the law to promote equality and collective dignity for Black people. Let me begin by expressing our profound gratitude to UCLA School of Law and the CRS program for hosting this wonderful event and for providing us with the space to hold our panel called Current Perspectives on Race and Law in Colombia. People in this room have contributed and continue to contribute to the development of critical race theory, a movement that exposes how law, far from being neutral, often work to preserve racial hierarchies. Our conversation today seeks to extend that critical lens southward, exploring how these insights resonate and sometimes also collide with the complex realities of Colombia and more broadly Latin America. Any panel of this sort must begin with asking a simple but crucial question. Why should a US audience care about how critical race theory has influenced the use of the law to confront racial injustice in Latin American countries such as Colombia? To answer that, we must first acknowledge a shared historical foundation. Latin America's experience with racial subordination cannot be separated from the global legacies of slavery and colonialism. Just as in the United States, racism in Colombia is deeply structural, as it organizes access to power, resources, and recognition. Studying Colombia, therefore, allows us to test, refine, and also expand the conceptual boundaries of CRT itself. It challenges us to see how structures of racial power operate outside of the US framework, revealing both the universality and the local specificity of white supremacy and racial domination. In the US, CRT has long critiqued the law's complicity in producing racial injustice. In Colombia, that critique encounters a different kind of obstacle, which is denial. For decades, Latin American societies have hidden racial hierarchies behind the ideology of mestizaje. The belief that racial mixture erased difference and created a harmonious, racially equal society. This narrative operates as a powerful legal and cultural veil, one that translates racial injustice into questions of class, therefore making race itself appear invisible. Against this backdrop, the Colombian experience offers unique and powerful contributions to the global debates on discrimination, racism, and the enduring legacies of slavery and colonialism. First, Colombia represents the collision between mestizaje and multiculturalism. The 1991 Constitution broke with centuries of racial silence by recognizing the country as a multi-ethnic and multicultural state, and by granting collective rights to Afro-descendants and indigenous peoples. This constitutional moment marked a radical shift from denial to recognition, but also exposed the limits of formal equality when confronted with entrenched structures of exclusion. Second, in recent decades, Colombia's judicial institutions have played a distinctive role in the pursuit of racial justice. The Colombian Constitutional Court in particular has developed a progressive jurisprudence protecting Afro-descendant collective land rights, addressing Black people's forced displacement, and recognizing the cultural autonomy of minority groups. Yet, these advances coexist with the persistence of structural racism within state institutions themselves, a paradox that reveals how formal commitments to equality can be undermined by the deeper racial logics that shape bureaucratic and judicial practice. Third, Colombia exemplifies the workings of pigmentocracy, a system in which phenotype, class, and geography interact to determine social mobility and access to justice. This fluid, color-graded reality challenges the binary understandings of race that dominate many legal systems, demanding instead a more nuanced intersectional analysis of colorism and structural discrimination. The struggle for racial justice in Colombia is therefore marked by tensions and contradictions between recognition and denial, between progressive law and limited enforcement of the same, between the promise of multiculturalism and the persistence of racial hierarchies. For US scholars and practitioners of CRT, engaging with these complexities can be deeply productive. The Colombian case reminds us that racial domination is a global structure with local expressions, and that the strategies of resistance developed in one context can illuminate struggles in another. Finally, before giving the word to my co-panelists, I would like to finalize emphasizing that this panel is an invitation. Let us look beyond the domestic frame. Let us build a truly transnational critical race dialogue, one that listens to and learns from the experience of the Global South. By engaging with Latin America and its scholarship and activism, CRT in the US can deepen its own theoretical reach, refine its methods, and strengthen its transformative potential. In doing so, we build a solidarity in a time in which working together is paramount. Now, to start this conversation, I have the honor of sharing this panel with three extraordinary colleagues and friends, each a leader in advancing racial justice through the law in Colombia. First, Mariluz Barragán González. She's a Colombian lawyer specializing in constitutional law and human rights advocacy. She currently serves as the Deputy Director of the Justicia, the Center for Law, Justice and Society, and is also a co-founder of ILEX Acción Jurídica. Mariluz holds an LLM in critical race studies from UCLA and is a doctoral candidate in advanced human rights studies at Carlos III University of Madrid. A Black woman from Cartagena, she has dedicated her career to challenging institutional racism through strategic litigation and public service in Colombia's highest courts and state institutions. Second, Dayana Blanco Acendra is the General Director of ILEX Acción Jurídica. She's a lawyer from the University of Cartagena with a postgraduate specialization in procedural law and economic law, and she also holds two masters, one in environmental and development from the National University of Colombia, and another from UCLA, where she specializes in CRT and intellectual property. Dayana's work bridges law, race, development, and culture with a focus on territorial rights and cultural appropriation. Dayana has worked with youth and migrant populations at the Los Angeles LGBT Center, connecting her advocacy in Colombia with broader struggles for equality across borders. Finally, Audrey Mena is the Deputy Director and co-founder of ILEX Acción Jurídica. She holds an LLM in International Human Rights Law from Notre Dame University and a law degree from the Technological University of Chocó. Audrey holds also a PhD from the University of Rosario. Audrey's work focuses on racial justice, collective rights, and ancestral knowledge, bringing together what she calls ancestral intelligence, a way of understanding law through the wisdom of Afro-descendant and indigenous communities. So to begin this discussion, Dayana, from a critical race theory standpoint, what key components define strategic litigation aimed at advancing racial injustice in Colombia? And how do these components challenge conventional understandings of law and neutrality?
Thank you so much, Daniel. Before starting, buenos días. Good morning. Before starting, I want to present Daniel too. He's co-founder of ILEX Acción Jurídica. Besides a great lawyer, he's attorney from the University of EAFIT. He holds an LLM from the University of California, Los Angeles. He's a doctorate from the University of Fordham, and he holds a very broad experience on constitutional law, and he's right now working in the Constitutional Court of Colombia. And did I say that you are co-founder of?
Yes,
yeah. Well, we are so excited of being here. I mean, being back of our university. These 3 days has been really full of enjoyment, happiness, and a lot of nostalgia, can I say? because I was just remembering my days here between 2017 and 2018, and it was a really difficult time for me because I mean it was a lot of reading, but right now I'm so happy of being here again, and I'm so thankful to you for being here listening to us. When I arrived at UCLA in 2017, I didn't know the journey I was about to begin, you know, a journey full of transformative experience, a journey that will change my life forever, and I'm not exaggerating, it really changed it. However, I was so immersed in readings, court rulings, and trying to manage my accent, you know, and my English. It was a moment of real suffer and pain. But it was like a revelation of my my interest in law. When I studied law, I didn't know my future of attorney because I didn't enjoy so much the profession. But I discovered like my interest in law when I discovered human rights law. But when I discovered the critical race study, I understand the way in which I should frame my practice in litigation, but also my practice in research. My time in the program taught me how to read, and this is also not an exaggeration. It was a new way of reading the law, and it was also a new way of understanding the world, because the way in which we learn the profession is a different way when we start this program. And this is gonna be so important because after 7 years of being graduate from the program and being practicing law under this frame named Critical Race Studies, I can say, of course, that my way of practicing is really changed, has really changed. I begin to see the career that I had studied 10 years before to be at UCLA, of being at UCLA, with other eyes. It became evident that the reflections of Hobbes, Locke, Rousseau about the appearance of the states were incomplete. It was necessary to add the perspective of, for example, Charles Mills under his racial contract, or Carol Paterban with her sexual contract. And I came to understand that the law is anything but neutral and universal. And of course, the judicial system, how it's built in our Latin American context, are not built to the liberation of historically excluded groups as Afro-descendants population. They are built in contrary to maintain the systems that creates the oppression. Particularly its penal and penitentiary branch are a trap that for decades has subjugated our people, especially young men, through police racial profiling, mass incarceration, and death. I'm telling this despite I know that for you maybe this is true, this is real. I mean, we are talking between people that study this topic, but in Latin American context, we get used to repeat this reality just to make it real, because under the judicial branch, under the academy, this is not a true, actually, but naturally true in our country. I also understood, as my thesis advisor, Professor Cheris Harris, explained to me, that witnesses is an element that guarantees rights, services, and property. I reflect on how blackness, in contrast, is perceived by white people as something that they could fragment, taking only what was useful or aesthetic, pleasant to them, such as music, food, or dance. I remember that my thesis essay, my graduation essay, was called Blackness to Go. And I was talking about how white people, or people not of color, I don't know how to say it, they used to fragmentate blackness, and they just take the part that pleased them. Likewise, or in the same way you go to a store and just choose what you want, that happened with blackness in the global north, but also in the global south. When I graduated from my master's at UCLA, I realized that my vocation as a human rights lawyer in Colombia now had a theoretical and methodological framework that will change the entire game of my litigation and research practicing. My calling was now to return to my country and apply this knowledge. Then when I come back to Colombia, because the reality was that I was studying here because an affirmative action. Neither my family nor I had the money to be here studying law. Then because affirmative action, I had the opportunity to be here. Then my way to give back that was to begin this collective dream we called ILEX Acción Jurídica, which was the way we found to give back to our people what we receive in a way of doing a real communitarian and revolutionary lawyering for the liberation of black people in Colombia. In these 7 years, we have been at ILEX Acción Jurídica reflecting on the challenges of applying the methodological and analytical framework of critical race studies in Latin American context. And to how Daniel already said, we are working on the following reflections. The first reflection is how not to be a good lawyer. That's the reflection, you know? And the good lawyer, I think, is that lawyer, that attorney that follows the rule that have been shown to them in the law school, in the classical way to be a lawyer, you know? Not just in the practice of being a lawyer, but in the aesthetic of look like a lawyer. Black people or indigenous people in our systems are not seen as nothing scientific or nothing professional. They are seen maybe as cultural actors or ethnic actors or artists or cookers, but not as scientists. Scientists, or not as a magicians, or not as attorneys. That the first thought was about how not to be a good lawyer for the system, and how to be a good lawyer for all people. And that, at this point, it's necessary to make a direct critique of the effects of the low representation of Afro-descendant population and indigenous population in the judicial branch. I mean, we don't have any references in the judicial branch in our countries. And when we ask to the public sector about representation, and this is a research we did last year with the participation of Daniel and other people of our team, we discovered that in Colombia, only about 1.8% of people under public branch sector, on the executive branch, self-recognize as Afro-descendants. Out of more than 87,000 public positions. I mean, under the executive branch, just 1.8% of the population self-recognize as Afro-descendants. I mean, that number is dramatic. It's so sad. This lack of representation makes extremely difficult for judges and magistrates to understand the role we play in pursuing of justice, and prevents the development of situated approach to conflict resolutions that take into account the experience of racialized people. It also means that we constantly interact with a system that is accustomed to seeing us as in a position of victims or in a position of defendants, never in a position of making the ruling. At the same time, this lack of representation intersects with the absence of institutional presence in our territories and a profound disrupt in the social rule of law. The people for whom we litigate don't trust in the idea of institutions, you know. We have a profound absence of trust in the institutionality, in the existence of the states. At the same time, we have to fight not just with that, but with illegal actors in the territory. When you have to fight with illegal actors in your territory, being a lawyer, the inclusion about race and gender in the analysis of a problem is the less of the problem that people in my country is thinking about. They are thinking about surviving and conserving the life. Then about the question, I'm about to answer the question.
5 minutes? Yes.
I feel that I have been talking like 3 hours. Because it's in English. Oh my God. Strategic litigation, I mean, the question was from a critical risk perspective, standpoint, what are the key components that define strategic litigation? The first one, I mean, when we are litigating in Colombia, a legal document that normally have like, I don't know, 20 pages, let's say. In our case, that same legal document have 50. Because we have to do 50 pages explaining to the judges what's the meaning of race, or what's the meaning of racism. Something that for this context is so clear and basic knowledge. In Latin American context, is still like a really new discovery. It's something like almost like esoteric race and racism. That's the first like key component of the strategic litigation. Then we have to do a systematic and deep casual analysis about what's the connection between fundamental rights and race and racism. It's not clear for the judicial branch yet. I mean, the judicial branch or the judges can make a really, really relevant analysis about the materialization of fundamental rights in the states, in the public institutions. However, that analysis almost never includes the racial approach. I mean, we have really relevant legal frameworks to defend, I don't know, protest rights, freedom of speech rights, to defend abuse, policing abuse, for example. But when we read these rulings, we don't find a really deep analysis or construction about the relationship between those problems on materialization of rights and the structural problem of racism. That's the first key component. The second component is the necessity of using the radical contextualization. And we use the analysis from the perspective of Lawrence Grosberg, who says that each reality, each situation is a configuration of relationships. I mean, not all legal frames, not all judicial ruling frames can be applied to all populations. You know, we have to do one case and one ruling for each person, for each group. We still questioning, in an active questioning of subordination structures, not just in the judicial branch, but in the educational, institutions, but in health, etc. In the Latin context, in the Latin American context, we have to deal with the deep negation and invisibilization of racism in the society, especially in the public sector, and at some point with the inefficiency and corruption of some institutions. We have to deal with the presence of illegal actors, as I say, in our territory. Then, just to close the answer, I think we still questioning the limitations of formal equality, and at this point, we like to use the analysis that Professor Crenshaw does about the restrictive understanding of the anti-discrimination law and the broad understanding of anti-discrimination law. We are working under our litigation practices for a broad understanding of anti-discrimination law, which means that we are doing litigation and research for a structural change of the judicial branch, but also of the Colombian state. Thank you.
Thank you. From your presentation, I just wanted to highlight how hard it is to actually litigate cases involving racial discrimination in Latin America, especially because of the lack of awareness and understanding of judicial institutions, judges, and in general, the public servants about race, racism, and how entrenched it is in the everyday experiences of Black people in Colombia and other countries in Latin America. Thank you, Diana. So let's continue with Mariluz. Mariluz, talking about racism in Latin America, and particularly in Colombia, comes with an initial challenge, which is that many claim that, unlike in the US or South Africa, the legal tradition does not show a formal legal system for the imposition of a racial regime. From the perspective of CRS, could you explain how the apparent silences on race in Colombian constitutions have not implied an absence of regulation, but rather served as an effective mechanism to legitimize an implicit racial order?
Thank you, Diane, for that question and the presentation, and thank you, Diana, for sharing us this reflection. So, Good morning to all of you, so colleagues and professors. After almost 10 years, it is an honor for me to stay back here in the School of Law and celebrating this 25th anniversary of CRS program. The result sounding maybe repetitive after 3 days of listening to the speeches of the alumni and after listening our colleagues Daniel and Diana. I believe that we cannot thank enough the CRS program for the opportunity to be here and also to shape the way in which we see and practice the law in our country. Indeed, in my opinion, so it could be said that this program has success in training a significant group of professionals who is changing now the field of legal studies in Colombia in the areas of constitutionalism and human rights by including the perspective of racial justice. I'm deeply honored to share this space with my admired colleagues of ILEX Acción Jurídica, professional dedicated of the critique and transformation of our legal system. And in the next few minutes, I will share with you some of the findings from my doctoral thesis, which is about to be published. Our presence here today acknowledges a fundamental truth. It is that the history of the modern constitutionalism in Colombia, despite presenting itself as a constant struggle of equality, is also a history of dispute and reconfiguration of the racial relations. As experts of critical race studies, we understand that foundational tensions pretty well. So the idea of the all men are created equal coexists with the racist ideology that justifies profoundly unequal and dehumanizing treatment from the past of the slavery to the present of serious deficit of the guarantees of fundamental rights for Afro and indigenous community. Colombia provides an ideal scenario for studying the regulation of race due to its continuous constitutional traditions since the 19th century and its large Afro-descendant population. That this is like the second largest after Brazil in Latin America. Despite this, the word race appears explicitly for the very first time, like Daniel just said, in the Constitution of 1991. In the Equality Clause in the Article 13, which prohibits discrimination based on sex, race, national or family origin, language, religion, political or philosophical opinion. However, discussion about race and racism has been present in the configuration of the legal institution since the earliest constitutions. This is something that it is not included for sure in our law curriculum, and the contrary continues to be denied in the teaching of constitutionalism in Colombia. The first constitutional test emerged in a society actually was in 1821. In Colombia, we have been like around 10 different constitutional tests, but the first one emerged in a society which a deeply rooted colonial stratification system known as the caste system or sistema de castas. The Republican idea of popular sovereignty was incompatible with the legal hierarchies imposed by caste. However, the socio-racial hierarchy of the colony did not disappear. In practice, the social category of race replaced the legal category of caste to determine each person's place in the society. In that way, racial categories in Colombian society have been present before, during, and after the caste system. The first constitution of Colombia, that was the Constitution of Cúcuta in 1821, declared all free men born in the territory as Colombians. This provision contradicted the reality that the institution of slavery was still enforced, which was a legal institution based entirely in a racial criteria, so exclusively affecting black people since the 16th century. So this constitutional silence about slavery reaffirmed de facto exclusion of the large portion of the black Afro descendants population from the emerging category of citizen. So that doesn't mean that basically the life of black people were not regulated in the French Constitution. The life were governed by norms regarding property, not but the legal regime applicable to persons of individuals. The total abolition of the slavery was constitutionalized in the Constitution of 1853. However, this advance was managed by including economic compensation for former slaveholders who had lost their human properties, but without integrating a structural reparation for the victims of slavery. Without a doubt, this is a scarf that remains open in Afro-Colombian people and communities. Although slavery was legally abolished, the racial order that had been established in Colombian society remains present in the Colombian constitutional order. The Constitution of 1991, as Daniel just mentioned, remarked a turning point by explicitly prohibit discrimination based on race. It also introduced a significant ethnic cultural recognition of Afro-Colombian in a couple of articles, specifically Article 770 and Transitory Article 55. Crucially, these norms refer to ethnic groups and black communities, without considering the historical role of race in the constitutive category of the constitutional and legal order. The recognition is justified primarily by cultural and ethnic difference. In Colombia, those who are working in issues in racial justice, as Diana already mentioned, face basically a really difficult paradox, is that we have to talking about race without naming it. And this is what has struck me deeply, because unlike on the field of feminism, for example, so that where we have like two different words, like a sex and gender. First, the sex referring to a biological difference, and the other gender referring to social construction. In racial studies, so there is no like those difference. Although attempts have been made to do so in this binomial race and ethnicity, the truth is that the word ethnicity usually refers to cultural difference but leave out the relationship and the history of subordination that the word race has inside. So, but what is race in the context of the constitutional court, in the constitutional law anyways? So I start from the point of the this scholar Justice Dusselstein thesis from the University of Colorado, which understand race as a legal concept whose notion and functions are determined by the decision makers. My question is not about the nature of the concept, but it is about how has been regulated race in the Colombian constitutional law. And after analyzing like our 10 different constitutional tests, I identify at least 3 different models in which the race has been regulated. Those are not like linear models, but I think that what I'm finding is like overlapping models that have been respond to a demand for equality of the Afro-Colombian people and communities. The first of them, Daniel, how many minutes do I have?
You have 4 minutes.
Okay, great. I'm full of time. So, the first is the first model I call negationist constitutionalism or constitucionalismo negacionista, and this basically denies the existence of the racial tensions in our society, and it is actually deeply rooted in the debates in the very first constitutional text. The abolition of the colonial case laws and the decree of foreign legal equality allowed elites to maintain informal patterns of discrimination under the narrative of the national harmony. The initial Republican constitutionalism coexists with the old regime regulation, and this denial consolidate the implicit racial rules through the apparently neutral regulation of rights such as liberty and citizenship. The second model is the mestizo constitutionalism, or constitucionalismo mestizo, which characterized by the exaltation of the mestizaje. This is not of the racial mixing. So it is different from the first one, because it is not just denial, but now we are like an exaltation of what we are, and actually base all our identity of this cultural homogeneity, right? And this model emerged after the abolition. Race regulation was limited to the constitutional prohibition of slavery and guaranteed formal equality. However, the ideology of mestizaje perpetuated discrimination by promoting whitening o blanqueamiento, not only legal and physically, but also moral and cultural. And I think that this is part of the presentation of the Audrey now after me. So, and this is basically subvaluating the Afro-descendants of indigenous components of the mixed. But even it could be worse when we think about the element of Afro or the black component of the mixed. And the persistence of discrimination was also managed through the discriminatory application of the apparently neutral laws, such as the laws against vagrancy or banditry, used to maintain the control over free men imposed in slavery society. And the last one is the ethnic constitutionalism, who is prominent model post-1991 constitution, and understand race as a criterion for negative state obligations. So, however, I need to take a little water. Excuse me. However, it restricts the possibility of using race as a criterion for developing positive obligation. So it is just restricted for using the category of race just to negative obligation. It means just to prohibit the discrimination against based on race. Accepting and adopting the scientific discredit of race and ignoring the validity as a social construction, there is no affirmative action in Colombia based on race. Positive obligation for Afro-descendants are justified primarily based on cultural difference as an ethnic group. This model is characterized by the normalization of racial hierarchy through the unequal recognition of collective rights. So the recognition of collective rights in Colombia communities has been significantly less extensive and slower compared to the indigenous community, demonstrating that racial hierarchies persist and are normalized through inequitable recognition that respond to other underlying racial criteria. I will stop here, and then after all, maybe with the next question, I can go deeper into describe the better the consequence of these different models of approach of race in Colombia. Thank you, Daniel.
Thank you, Mariluz. I just wanted to highlight something from your presentation, which is that all those three models that you developed, in a certain way, are also presented as the best possible ways to counter racial discrimination. So the first one, the best way to address is simply not mentioning the existence of racism altogether. The second one basically says that the best way to address racism is simply to come to the agreement that we're all mixed. That therefore, there's no need to talk about it either. And the third one is a little bit more complicated because it's like we can acknowledge difference as long as it's articulated in a language in which the mainstream society and the state is comfortable with it. So thank you so much for that construction. And in third place, I would like to now draw the attention to Audrey. And Audrey, regarding all of these conversations that we were having today, there's something that I wanted to ask, which is how can a critical race theory be understood not only through its critical dimension, the critique of these institutions, but also as a tool to reveal how it can be used to construct something, what is its constructive bets in terms of attaining racial equality.
Yes, thank you so much to my colleagues to bring me here. I'm actually from UCLA, but when I started to be the co-founder of ILEX Acción Jurídica, they bring to me this idea to fight also for critical studies issues in Colombia. So for me, to me, it's a great honor to be here and to reflect this question that is not only a theoretical thing, it's a deeply personal statement in my life, how to be practice all that stuff that we also conceptualize in the academic, how to see that in practice. And as you mentioned, critical race studies or CRT as often being understood as a critical project of ways to expose how the law, policies, and institutions reproduce racial dominations, and that how the law covers of these racism issues. And that is powerful because it has helped us, generation of scholars and lawyers, uncover what the law tried to hide. The racism is not an accident, it's a structure. So that's powerful because it's the way that we are here always talking about these things. However, this is the heart of my presentation of reflection today, is the critical race studies also can be understood as a constructive way, as a method of legal creation, a way to imagine and build the new legal meanings from Black epistemologies and ancestral intelligence. That is another part of these discussions. Because when we were thinking about how to articulate all that discussions, my worries about traditional knowledge and working with ethnic community, and also we see that kind of discussion only one topics like maybe police violence or racism in the educations, but we are not talking about how the beginnings of this start, that is the identity of Black people when we were confronted. So in this sense, my question is how to talk about revealing not only just injustice, but also to see the way in the practice how these critical studies came from. And I'm gonna show you, and I'm gonna talk about one case that we have in this litigation practice. That is a constitutional judgment T-128 of 2022, when the Constitutional Court of Colombia recognized midwifery as a cultural heritage and ancestral intelligence. It's for the first time the court said this is not folklore, this is knowledge, and it must be protected by the law. That case illustrates the constructive dimension of CRT because the law did not simply include a marginalized group. It's transforming itself to listen to different voices that not were born in the university but also in the community. You know, when the law listened to those voices, and in the case of Afro-Colombian midwife, who was protected life, health, and dignity for generations, to start to rebuild its own foundations. And that is what I mean a constructive CRT, laws as a living dialogue with ancestral wisdom. That is the other part that we have to put into in this place. And at ILEX, when we work together, Diana and I, we try to make this idea daily practice. Like, we understand racial justice not only as a matter of winning cases, but as a matter of building living legal architectures. Our goal is not only litigate, but is to transform how law itself produce knowledge about Afro-descendant people in different states or populations. And that means designing public policies that recognize the knowledge of, for example, midwife as a part of the national health system, defending the right of ancestral knowledge against extractivism and demanding ethno-racial data, because without visibility, there cannot be accountability, and without accountability, there is no justice. These are not only legal actions, they are epistemic actions. They change who was the power to name, to measure, to define reality. So through this approach, law stopped being just a tool for inclusions or become a language of co-creations, the states and the community. And that's my invitations in these conversations and all of these states. We have to work, to have to put it together all of that kind of perspective about what is law, what is racial justice in the case of different Afro-descendants, way to see the life. And I'm gonna stop here this first question.
Okay, thank you so much, Audrey. I just wanted to point at something in your presentation which is very, very important, is that the type of litigation that you were describing is not only substantial because of the results, but also because of the need to create a new type of language and new categories to make sure that the judicial system can actually encompass and understand the types of struggles that are being brought before it. So I just wanted to highlight that because I think it's a very important exercise. So coming back to you, Mariluz. As we have been discussing up to this point, the ethnic model embraces the biological aspect, discrediting race, and justifies positive obligations for Afro-descendants based on cultural and ethnic difference. What is the direct consequence of this explicit disconnection of the historical category of race from the basis of positive obligations?
Okay, thank you, Daniel, for this question. I start to saying that maybe the most direct consequences is that when we use and we just try to replace like a simple word, so we are like taking out or taking away the history behind the word. So this is why we cannot just like try to replace a race and an ethnic, because it is something that it is not taking into consideration the history of racial hierarchies in Colombia, and also that the relation is not just the difference, but this is a matter of subordination, and that is why it's not working just to replace one for another. So this is maybe like the first consequence that I can highlight. The other is like the ethnic approach has resulted until today on a unequal and limited recognition, because most of the ethnical approach has been built on the indigenous experiences, and that didn't took into consideration the African or Afro-descendants experiences to try to build this like the parameters of the catalog of the tribe, the rights. And also what happens today is that it has been like as a result, so we have a much slower process of recognition for Afro-descendants, because we have first to go before court and try to convince them that we are like an ethnic group, right? And why we are entitled to those kind of kind of rights, because the constitutional rights doesn't like have our, not only our name but also our experience. And also, and this is even worse in this, digamos, in this moment, because due to the phenomenon of territorial displacement, of the forced displacement in Colombia caused by the internal conflict, Black communities and individuals have to migrate or was forced to migrate to the cities. And this has accelerated the process of cultural assimilation of a bunch of people, Black people in Colombia. And as a result, so we have a significant majority of Black community that share the majority culture, right? Which means that they are not like ethnically different, right? But therefore, but they are still like facing and struggling and suffer like a exclusion because of their racial identity. And I think that this is why I think that it is not enough just to try to move, because with another category that as you just mentioned, they stay seems like a more comfortable with, but the category which actually is like integrate the experience that we wanna to express in the specific category that this is race.
Thank you, Mariluz. Now, Diana, what have been the principal epistemic and institutional challenges in implementing CRT as a methodological and analytical framework within the judicial systems of Colombia and also in Latin America?
Okay, I'm gonna talk since the ILEX experience. A group of Afro-Colombian attorneys that come to the country with this magic box called critical race studies. Then we have identified like at least two challenges. One, the epistemic challenges, you know, about, for example, the way in which we build knowledge under law schools, for example, and in the way in which the judicial branch understand law in relationship with Afro-descendant population. And I think that has a really close relationship with Mariluz just mentioned. I mean, the judicial branch see Afro-descendant population in Colombia, and I can say also this about the executive branch. They see Afro-descendant population in Colombia as an ethnic group. I mean, they are only weighing the judicial decisions about, for example, territorial rights or cultural rights, or even in the Colombian context, because we live in an armed conflict context, which has disproportionate effects in ethnic communities. Judicial branch understand that always we call the judges through legal suits. We are expecting decisions on peace, for example. But they don't connect or legal necessities with problems as freedom of speech or problems as education or problems as fiscal policies in our country or problems as statistic invisibility of Afro-descendant population. I mean, there is like something happened in Colombian states or Colombian public offices that see us just a group that has some specific legal needs, then we have to rebuild that knowledge about legal problems of Afro-descendant population. We have to rebuild the idea about what are the obligations of the Colombian state for the dignity, wellness, and life of Afro-descendant population. Not just under the ethnic category, but also under the racial category. And I think that has become the most important epistemic fight about law in Colombia. How can we do that the judicial branch, the executive branch, the private sector understand race and accept that race, racism, racial discrimination exists in Colombia? And I can say this also about countries like Ecuador, Peru, Mexico. Brazil, I think, is other story. It's a different story. But I can say that about the whole Latin American context, that see us like a group that is associated to a territory and a specific kind of dance. It's very difficult. We have to build also other epistemic knowledge about the individualistic versus structural visions of social problems. And we are fighting all the time with public institutions and private sector about how understand the oppression in Colombia against Afro-descendant population. And we are fighting right now with the understanding about concepts as affirmative actions, or the understanding of concepts about gender approach, or, for example, my answer becomes just when Professor Crenshaw, because we are fighting right now with the understanding of intersectionality, you know, because despite we know what's the meaning of that, no, for public policies or for the state, it's so easy convert the intersectional approach in an additive model, in a model that is just understand that you are a black woman, and that's it. And didn't connect that with the structural problem. And I'm not sure that it's because they don't understand the problem, but maybe it's because they want to understand the problem like that, because they don't want to embrace, that's the word, the whole problem. And we are fighting with the simplification of our identity all the time, you know? The simplification of our identity, of the role of our identity, for example, in public policies to fight racial profiling or to fight police violence. And that simplification is, for example, we have to work with the state to talk about police reforms, for example. When I'm doing this conversation in countries like United States or in countries like Brazil, and I speak about police reform, people is, why, if you call yourself a critical race, you know, alumni, or a feminist, black feminist person, why are you talking about police reforming? You have to talk about abolition. But when you live in a country under an armed conflict for more than 50 years, talking about the abolition of the police or abolition of the jails, that's esoteric, that's magic, that's not gonna happen. Yeah, that's not gonna happen. For that reason, we have to work with the state to see how can we reform the police, for example. And when I talk about simplification, is in the way that understand that is, well, this is my policy for you. Then we are gonna add to this protocol that the police, when go to black neighborhoods, that they have to understand that blacks dance this special dancing. And we are gonna do some encounters and some events just for the kids, just for them to learn how to dance, for example, I don't know, mapale. which is a traditional dance of our country for black people. But they don't talk about racism and policing. They don't talk about that. Then I'm talking about the simplification of our fighting in that way. And we also have to fight some institutional challenge. You know, the first institutional challenge. And in this context is so, I feel, is maybe regular to talk about race and racism. But when we need as organization, for example, when ILEX begins the recruiting of attorneys, it's very difficult for us to recruit attorneys with this approach. For that reason, I think this program, this critical race studies program, and the scholarship we receive have been like a, you know, like a changing point, not just in her life, but in the way in which attorneys, black attorneys, participate in the national debates about racism, in the way in which black attorneys, Afro-Colombian attorneys, participate in the social transformation, because we are building this. We are building this knowledge. Then that's the first, I mean, institutional challenge. And that institutional challenge has everything to do with law schools in our countries. 2 years ago, we started like an initiative that is called Ennegreciendo el Derecho. And what's the meaning of that? Blackening?
Blackening the law.
Blackening the law. And we have been calling all the law schools in Colombia just to ask them, how are you teaching law? How many Afro-Colombian professors have you hired in the last 30 years? How many black authors are the students reading? That's a really, really deep institutional challenge we are fighting for. Nobody asked in ILEX how many months we take to build an attorney with this perspective. And I'm just gonna talk about other institutional challenge, because I don't have more time. I mean, the structure of the Latin American context makes very difficult to materialize court rulings. Even when the court rulings are the best court rulings you can have. I mean, you can have the best court ruling in your life. I mean, we got this sentence called the sentence T276 of 2022, where the Constitutional Court recognized that the Colombian state make a really bad harm on Afro-Colombian population because of the statistic invisibility of the census of 2019. We also participate in the ruling about the despenalization. Decriminalization of abortion in Colombia. You know, under or hasta? How can I say? Hasta.
That's okay.
The decriminalization of abortion in Colombia.
Up to the 24.
Up to the 24 months. We participate on that. But what happened with these rulings in Colombia? That if you don't have the institutional structure around the whole country, black women can know that they can have like an intervention to make an abortion up to 24 weeks. Up to 24 weeks. But if I don't have internet in my territory, if I don't have cell phones in my territory, if I don't have a doctor in my territory, do you think that ruling cares for Afro-Colombian women? It doesn't care. Then we have to fight the institutional challenge of lack of structure in our country, technological structure, medical structure, you know, official institutions to make the law possible for our people.
Thank you, Diana. And I just wanted to take a moment just to recognize how the work that particularly you have been leading within ILEX has, I think, for the very first time, giving a voice to black women in the legal debates that are taking place at the highest level of the Colombian state, and I think it's very important to also recognize.
Thank you.
And finally, Audrey, how can Afro-Latin American experiences like the recognition of midwifery or traditional beach making help reimagine law as a space for healing and not only for punishment?
Thank you so much. I'm just gonna say that I have a really deep dream is to see these critical race studies as in the future as a way to create new worlds of justice, care, and collective life. Yes, I think that we are working in Colombia is to trying to do a different way to change the way how the judicial framework, educational framework think about the access to right for Afro-descendant people. And for that reason, for us in ILEX, the law is also a space of creation, yes, a place where communities rebuild justice through their own knowledge or memory. When are obsessed to talk or work about ancestral knowledge and what is come from the meaning of justice for communities, is also a way to rebuild the way as our identity in Colombia has been created, just as an indigenous assimilation. So I'm this other part to be like fighting with my self-identification as a Black rural Afro-descendant, but also as a Black attorney, because it's not the only way to see the law, to critique the law, but only we have the opportunity in Colombia. We did 2 or 3 court decisions to changing the way as the constitutional court judges are like giving an interpretations about the law of Black people. Also, why I say that, because in this point, we have to work in different areas. I think that we all have a mission in these kind of things about the resignificate the law. One is talking about the lack of the missing of the institutional court in the interpretations of the category of race in every problem. Another is talking about how the representations and data means to have public policies that can, that goes to the people that need, and other people, as maybe Diana and I, we are working to create this structure where these laws that are creating, interpreting can be like a real access to right for Afro-descendant people. And I think what I'm gonna say is we all have missions in this context, and the academic has a big responsibility in the way that we are like trying to interpret the law in countries as Colombia, where the identity of Blackness has been essentialized to one kind of Blackness. So I want to recognize this work that we are doing right now, because it's big for the transformation that our country needs. And in the beginning, Daniel talked about the invitation to have these conversations, what we from the South bring to you to the North. That is a different kind of see, and we are always working together. So it's the last thing that I'm gonna say in this panel about the importance to have different approach, like an epistemic actions in the law.
Thank you so much, Audrey. And I think we can stop for now, just to give you wonderful people who have joined us for the past hour and 10 minutes, just a moment so you can ask any questions you might have. And we also have additional questions that we have prepared. So if you have any questions, it will be a wonderful time to do them. Yes.
It's wonderful that you're here. Great to welcome back former students and possibly future students. And I really a great, very coherent and interesting original presentation. I have a question about the centralization of government versus decentralization. So different countries in Latin America have different degrees of centralization, right? Brazil, famous for being decentralized. recent case a couple of years ago where the Sao Paulo court recognized the rights of a Quilombola community, and that was at the state level, right? Now, Colombia is known for being very centralized. And so how does that degree of centralization of the court system, of the government, affect what you do and the kinds of ways that you plan strategies to end, address racism in a centralized context? Or are there options, are there more local options in the courts that would make sense? So that's fine. I don't know, so anyone.
Anyone who wants to start, or?
Okay, I can.
Maybe
So,
can we have a-
yeah. Although this is like a really centralized system, I will focus on the judicial branch. It is really centralized, but it has like a limitation because it is so difficult, for example, for the high courts to understand better the conditions of the black communities. Most of them are in rural areas, and some of them are actually in urban areas, but in a really marginalized, can I say, like a condition that they are not actually close to. And this is maybe like one of the limitations of have a really centralized, at least judicial branch, because the Constitutional Court have all the decision should be applies for all judges, but at the same time, I think that we have a really kind of progressive, at least Constitutional Court, and has been like a really open to this cost. I cannot say that maybe for the example, I don't know if Diana mentioned before, but this specific decision about the census in Colombia. So if we do design a good litigation, so, and we have the court understand the cost, so it is possible to irradiate the whole system. So, and because of the legitimacy of at least the Constitutional Court have, this is something that if we point in that, if we put the finger in that, in that issue, and the court understand good, so it could irradiate the whole system. And at the same time, can I say this is a limitation, but at the same time, because of the configuration that we have today, at least for these courts, it is kind of good. I don't know what is happening in the next years, because we are having a shifting in a conservative way. So we don't know what is happening, but until now, so it has been working pretty well. So I can say that. I don't know if you have
I have short, small reflection about that. I think in the litigation practice, it's different between the public policy making when we are talking about centralization or decentralization. I mean, Colombia is a decentralized country.
kind of, yeah.
Yeah, in the Constitution. In the Constitution, it is. Yeah. But when we are talking about judicial branch, we have judges in all the territory, and all the judges can judge in constitutional law, all the judges. What's the problem? That when we are in the minor level judges, they have more struggle to understand how race and racism works. That when we are litigating under the Constitutional Court, the problem is the way to get to the Constitutional Court is very heavy, long, and difficult. You know, it's a long, long way to get to the Constitutional Court. Then, to talk about race and racism in Colombia, we have to get to the Constitutional Court. Then, the time is changed, because the litigation under the constitutional law can take easily 4 years. Yeah. Not all the time the constitutional law, the Constitutional Court is interested in talking about race. You know, that's one way. but in relationship with the judicial branch, the executive branch, I think the judicial branch works better under the decentralization model. But the executive branch, which is the one that have to make the public policies, and which is the one that have to comply the rulings, they have a different understanding of the country, which is irradiate from the center. They don't know the territory. Then I think we have to move in those two worlds of centralization and decentralization in the same country.
And you know what example we can share is in this work in ILEX, we haven't been like working with institutional ministers as a health system. One speech from our president about race changed all the work that we were doing. So we were working with them about to change some public policies for recognitions of the word race in the public policies of health in Colombia. And we have been like so close to that workers. One speech changed about race, changed the things that we have been doing with that workers. So that's the executive impact about not understanding the race issues for Black people.
Yeah, we were working in a public policy with the Minister of Health, and we also agree in including the racial and ethnic approach and all the explanation about the structural effects of racism. And after that public speech of the president saying that the race doesn't exist, they keep back everything. And they erase all the dissertation about race in the document.
So we are still fighting.
Yeah.
No, and I just wanted to add something very minor to the conversation, which is that when you compare racial justice mobilization, particularly as applied to Black people and Black communities, I think that's more centralized in the conversation with the state than when you look at other social movements. So, for example, within the other identity groups, when you think about the LGBTQ population, so you have a national LGBTQ public policy, and then you have regional public policies applied to LGBTQ communities. When you look at Afro-Colombians, what you have usually is national policies, because there's very little interest in local governments or regional governments to get involved in something that they see as divisive, as race, Black people, or even ethnic rights, which is like the most accepted conceptual framework to deal with the issues that we were discussing. So I think also, even though we have seen progress over the past 50 years under the new Colombian Constitution of 1991, I think that when compared to other historically discriminated groups, Black people face certain types of struggles and barriers than even things that are comparatively more, or can be as comparatively controversial, do not face, because of those structural systems of oppression that remain to be changed, but persist to be overlooked by public authorities. And we just ran out of time. So I just wanted to take a moment again to thank the law school, the CRS program, and to, I'm sorry.
She ran out of time. I do, first of all, I'm so proud of you guys. So happy to see you and welcome back. My question, you partially answered it, but, and maybe you talked about it earlier, but of course, the trajectory of critical race projects here has changed substantially since you all were here. And I was curious about whether there was those winds of retrenchment that we're experiencing here, how have they been experienced in Colombia? And so I'm hearing the story that you were just telling about the one speech. When did that happen? Has that happened in this current period of retrenchment here in the United States as any response to what might be seen as vulnerability against this administration's efforts to reestablish the big stick, you know, in its so-called region? Did this happen before, you know, the Trump administration? And Daniel, with respect to the comparison, I'm really keen to know what the comparison is between indigenous discourses and Afro-Colombian discourses.
Who wants to start?
Okay, so I will start with the last question. So because it is absolutely fascinating the way that we can see like a continuum in the history of the constitutional law in Colombia. So the asymmetry of the guarantees between indigenous and Afro-Colombians. So it is like absolutely clear, incredible. So we have around maybe 30 norms in our constitution that develop like a catalog of rights for indigenous versus we have like a 3 for Afro-Colombians. So, and actually these have like a specific, for sure, a result of the deficit of the guarantees of the fundamental rights. And this is something that people in general, decision makers and judges feel kind of comfortable with. So this is something that is absolutely naturalized, can I say? Naturalized in the legal and the constitutional discourse. For example, maybe was in 2024, the last year. So we have like in this catalog of indigenous people, so they have rights to land, they have rights to autonomy, they have the right to have like an independent jurisdiction, the indigenous people. And because all the time they say that basically most of the same rights of indigenous Afro-Colombians who are have a different and experience a different culture also have like the same rights. And a specific community asked for the recognition of the independent jurisdiction also for Afro-Colombian communities. And what happened? The court just in a decision of 3 pages. It wasn't more than 3 pages. It was 3 or maybe 5. So it was really just so easily, so quickly say, no, you don't have right to independent jurisdiction because it is not in the Constitution. It was so easily to say that. And that we now see is there is something that should be at least to pay to call the attention of the constitutional lawyers, but also of the progressive movement that it's supposed that are fighting for the equality. And also just about the first question. So about this specific situation of the president of Colombia that saying race doesn't exist and if it's linked or not with the environment that you have here in the United States. I think that this is not like I don't think they have like a relation because actually Petro is like in the other side of the ideological the ideological spectrum, even though what we have experience in Colombia is that even progressive movement and progressive scholars doesn't have like an understanding of what race mean and what is the importance of this agenda. For example, in ILEX last year, so a specific congressman who was really progressive, so have like a brilliant idea just to raise like the word race out of the constitution, the constitutional disposition, because say no, race doesn't exist. This just go deeper in the racism and the racial discrimination. And actually, it was because of a specific advocacy initiative of ILEX Acción Jurídica, it was possible to stop this initiative. So something like we were saying you will be you will turn working in this agenda even harder because we have to fight against racism and fight against racial discrimination without naming it.
Yeah.
So this is something that that this is like you have to fight against, I don't know, for the gender equality, but you cannot, like I say, women. So this is something that people, I think, that never gonna think in that terms. But in race, it's so easy to do that. So, and this is, I think that the lack of understanding is in the both side of the spectrum. So here and then, so yeah, definitely.
No, I have just a thought about Trump. Because it is. I feel that when in Colombia Francia Marquez got to the vice presidency, we opened a national conversation about racism in Colombia. It was very, very clear. It wasn't a nice conversation, okay? It was a conversation about a country that neglects racism, attacking to a woman because she didn't have the right to be there because she is a black woman. And that was very clear in the national conversation. And that gave us the opportunity to say, you see, are you seeing that?
Yeah.
You are a racist country, you know? And I feel that now with Trump, the conversation is being is contracting, you know, in so many levels. I mean, in the political level, he's making a lot of decisions that is having consequences in the democratic dynamics of our countries. For example, his decision on call our president a narco dealer, you know, or his decision of cutting funds to fight against conflict, or I don't know, drugs, I don't know. You know, those decisions are changing the game in which, for example, some civil society organizations works under any topic, because fundraising for DEI is changing too. And that's changing. The way in which a lot of organizations talk about this are gonna change too. Then, for example, we thought the political decision of keep doing our work, but that political decision has financial consequences that are being framed for what's happening in the geopolitical complexity of the world, right?
Perhaps just to add something to the conversation is that although rivers of ink will be spent trying to understand and describe the impact that the Trump administration has had on movements for racial and gender justice all over the world, I think that there are very specific ways in which the domestic context in the US is projecting is projecting abroad. And just to answer the second question, I don't think that the intention or the direct consequences to alter or influence the actions of the current government. I think it's a bit about having an impact on future elections. We have a presidential election that's going to take place next year. And I think there's a question about whether or not this type of a tit for tat that's happening between Trump and many world leaders, including the President of Colombia, might have an impact on what happens in the presidential election. I think the reverse would be what's happening with the President of Argentina, Milei, and how that the close relation, the special relationship that Trump has with Milei, might also have play a role in the elections that are coming ahead. So I think it's might not be something as immediate as whether or not that's having an influence right now the actions of the current administration in Colombia. I think is also about making sure that that influence or that impact is felt in the future. Is felt, in the years to come.
Thank you.
Thank you so
Thank
much.
you so much.